Chapter 15. No More a Child. There was a moment that winter. I was kneeling on the carpet, listening to Dad testify of Mother's calling as a healer, when my breath caught in my chest, and I felt taken out of myself. I no longer saw my parents or our living room. What I saw was a woman grown, with her own mind, her own prayers, who no longer sat childlike at her father's feet. I saw the woman's swollen belly, and it was my belly. Next to her sat her mother, the midwife. She took her mother's hand and said she wanted the baby delivered in a hospital, by a doctor. "I'll drive you," her mother said. The women moved toward the door, but the door was blocked. By loyalty, by obedience, by her father. He stood immovable. But the woman was his daughter, and she had drawn to herself all his conviction, all his weightiness. She set him aside and moved through the door. I tried to imagine what future such a woman might claim for herself. I tried to conjure other scenes in which she and her father were of two minds, when she ignored his counsel and kept her own. But my father had taught me that there are not two reasonable opinions to be had on any subject. There is truth and there are lies. I knelt on the carpet, listening to my father, but studying this stranger, and felt suspended between them, drawn to each, repelled by both. I understood that no future could hold them. No destiny could tolerate him and her. I would remain a child in perpetuity, always, or I would lose him. I was lying on my bed, watching the shadows my feeble lamp cast on the ceiling, when I heard my father's voice at the door. Instinctively, I jerked to my feet in a kind of salute, but once I was standing, I wasn't sure what to do. There was no precedent for this. My father had never visited my room before. He strode past me and sat on my bed, then patted the mattress next to him. I took my seat nervously, my feet barely touching the floor. I waited for him to speak, but the moments passed silently. His eyes were closed, his jaw slackened, as if he were listening to seraphic voices. "I've been praying," he said. His voice was soft, a loving voice. "I've been praying about your decision to go to college." His eyes opened. His pupils had dilated in the lamplight, absorbing the hazel of the iris. I'd never seen eyes so given over to blackness. They seemed unearthly, tokens of spiritual power. "The Lord has called me to testify," he said. "He is displeased. You have cast aside his blessings to whore after man's knowledge. His wrath is stirred against you. It will not be long in coming." I don't remember my father standing to leave, but he must have, while I sat gripped by fear. God's wrath had laid waste to cities. It had flooded the whole earth. I felt weak, then wholly powerless. I remembered that my life was not mine. I could be taken out of my body at any moment, dragged heavenward to reckon with a furious father. The next morning I found Mother mixing oils in the kitchen. "I've decided not to go to BYU," I said. She looked up, fixing her eyes on the wall behind me, and whispered, "Don't say that. I don't want to hear that." I didn't understand. I thought you'd be glad to see me yield to God. Her gaze shifted to me. I hadn't felt its strength in years, and I was stunned by it. "Of all my children," she said, "you were the one I thought would burst out of here in a blaze. I didn't expect it from Tyler. That was a surprise. But you? Don't you stay. Go. Don't let anything stop you from going." I heard Dad's step on the stairwell. Mother sighed, and her eyes fluttered, as if she were coming out of a trance. Dad took his seat at the kitchen table, and Mother stood to fix his breakfast. He began a lecture about liberal professors, and Mother mixed batter for pancakes, periodically murmuring in agreement. Without Sean as foreman, Dad's construction business dwindled. I'd quit my job at Randy's to look after Sean. Now I needed money, so when Dad went back to scrapping that winter, so did I. It was an icy morning, much like the first, when I returned to the junkyard. It had changed. There were still pillars of mangled cars, but they no longer dominated the landscape. A few years before, Dad had been hired by Utah Power to dismantle hundreds of utility towers. He had been allowed to keep the angle iron, and it was now stacked, 400,000 pounds of it, in tangled mountains all over the yard. I woke up every morning at 6 to study, because it was easier to focus in the mornings, before I was worn out from scrapping. Although I was still fearful of God's wrath, I reasoned with myself that my passing the ACT was so unlikely it would take an act of God. And if God acted, then surely my going to school was His will. The ACT was composed of 4 sections: math, English, science, and reading. My math skills were improving, but they were not strong. While I could answer most of the questions on the practice exam, I was slow, needing double or triple the allotted time. I lacked even a basic knowledge of grammar, though I was learning, beginning with nouns and moving on to prepositions and gerunds. Science was a mystery, perhaps because the only science book I'd ever read had detachable pages for coloring. Of the 4 sections, reading was the only one about which I felt confident. BYU was a competitive school. I'd need a high score, a 27 at least, which meant the top 15% of my cohort. I was 16, had never taken an exam, and had only recently undertaken anything like a systematic education. Still, I registered for the test. It felt like throwing dice, like the roll was out of my hands. God would score the toss. I didn't sleep the night before. My brain conjured so many scenes of disaster, it burned as if with a fever. At 5, I got out of bed, ate breakfast, and drove the 40 miles to Utah State University. I was led into a white classroom with 30 other students who took their seats and placed their pencils on their desks. A middle-aged woman handed out tests and strange pink sheets I'd never seen before. "Excuse me," I said when she gave me mine. "What is this?" "It's a bubble sheet to mark your answers." "How does it work?" I said. "It's the same as any other bubble sheet." She began to move away from me, visibly irritated, as if I were playing a prank. "I've never used one before." She appraised me for a moment. "Fill in the bubble of the correct answer," she said. "Blacken it completely. Understand?" The test began. I'd never sat at a desk for 4 hours in a room full of people. The noise was unbelievable, yet I seemed to be the only person who heard it, who couldn't divert her attention from the rustle of turning pages and the scratch of pencils on paper. When it was over, I suspected that I'd failed the math, and I was positive that I'd failed the science. My answers for the science portion couldn't even be called guesses. They were random, just patterns of dots on that strange pink sheet. I drove home. I felt stupid, but more than stupid, I felt ridiculous. Now that I'd seen the other students, watched them march into the classroom in neat rows, claim their seats, and calmly fill in their answers, as if they were performing a practice routine, it seemed absurd that I had thought I would score in the top 15%. That was their world. I stepped into overalls and returned to mine.